Okay, welcome friends and colleagues and the people out there on the Zoom land, although we're not on Zoom, are we? We're on Cisco WebEx, I believe, which is so in Cisco WebEx land. Welcome. This is it's a great opportunity and a great pleasure, really, not just to welcome Martin. It's true we haven't seen him physically for a while, but we've seen you at a distance on many occasions, Martin, and you'll be back very shortly amongst us.
Definitely, definitely.
And Martin's in a way, Martin's one of the dynamic young people we have in the department, and we have quite a large number of these now as the department's growing and becoming even more exciting. And we have Jang Shin here, and we have Samsung, who's not here, but it doesn't matter. Basically, this seminar has been organised for really quite a long time, because we had, towards the end of last year, we organised a seminar series. And the main idea here was that colleagues could present actually work in progress or work that indeed has been completed to a friendly audience, but it would be rigorous, friendly, rigorous audience. So we had five talks organised, mobilising notably our PhD students. Now, those all had to be postponed because we know why, because of the COVID-19. So, but now we're revisiting this series. Kenneth Chan, our participant, have been instrumental in organising them, so thanks for that, Kenneth. And so, essentially, this is the first one. We've got a whole interesting, exciting series. Emily, I believe you're next, so that's super. So please bear with us, and please attend and assist. Essentially, Martin doesn't need much introduction. He's featured as a young researcher on the university website, so that you should have all, of course, read that in advance. But Martin's an assistant professor with us in the Department of Government and International Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University. He's also, it must be said, a visiting research fellow at Queen's University Belfast, and I think, Martin, that makes sense in the current circumstances. And indeed, QUB is a very good institution. It's the sort of institution we want to be associated with. Okay? That's just for our friends in QUB who might be listening, hopefully. If not, you can come back and listen. You're welcome at any time, of course. Martin's worked very much actually on themes of transitional justice and truth. And I know that this is the topic of your work today, Martin. I know that you frame this in a rather larger comparative context as well. But I think that's enough from me. Let's move over straight away to listen to Dr. Martin Chung, Transitional Justice and Truth Recovery in Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Belfast Agreement.
All right, thank you very much. First of all, can you hear me clearly? I don't have to speak like this, right? I think it's fine like this. Okay, great. So thank you, Alistair, our head of department, and also especially Dr. Kenneth Chan, my colleague, and also Terence and Ivan for putting this together. Like Alistair said, it's really originally the idea is to have really the platform for us to read drafts of our manuscripts, to hear intra-departmental critique and advice on improvement and so on. I'm happy that this idea has come to fruition with this series. Okay, today's presentation is based on the project, an ongoing project that I have, looking at the politics of antagonism, or lingering problem of antagonism in Northern Ireland since the Good Friday Agreement signed in 1998. And the presentation is based on two articles of mine. One got published. I have to apologize that it's not my intention to present a published paper, but as Kenneth would know, we first conceptualized the series back in, when was that, late last year? And my talk was supposed to be in February this year. And at that time, the article was in a revise and resubmit kind of progress. And in the meantime, time moves on. And so it has been published. So I will just try to go through this paper rather quickly and speak more on my second paper, talking about the negative effects of COVID-19. Well, the second paper was supposed to be to have been presented in the last Political Studies Association conference in April in Edinburgh, but as you all know, it didn't come about because of the coronavirus. And so I have it as a finished first draft, and hopefully, I don't know, may be able to present it in the next PSA conference in Belfast, actually. So even better, even more to the point. Now, so in that sense, comments are welcome for both papers, because even with the topic of statutory limitation, it is still a very timely topic. As some of you might know, the current bill trying to introduce some kind of what they call statutory presumption against prosecution of British soldiers and veterans just received its second reading, or the first debate in the House of Commons yesterday. And of course, with the supermajority that the Conservatives have, they had no difficulty of getting it passed. And so I think it is still a very relevant topic that I might still continue to make some outputs out of it. And comments are welcome for both published and unpublished work. I would also like to acknowledge, I don't know whether they are here, but there are people who contacted me, or I contacted them because of today's talk, including Mr. Mike Chinoy, who is the author of a latest book published this year about Kevin Boyle, who is one of the key figures in the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland. And so I would be happy to hear their comments as well, including, of course, also Dr. Timothy Agarin, who's the director of the Center for the Study of Ethnic Conflict at Queen's, who is my host, in fact, there. Now, first of all, a word about the transitional justice and truth recovery, the two main terms in my presentation. TJ, or transitional justice, is, very simply defined as the conception or application of justice during political transition, meaning transition from variants of non-democracy towards a democratic political system. Although theoretically you can say maybe there's another type of transition, going back from a rule of law based kind of system to a non-democratic system. In that sense, we might want to talk about Hong Kong, but that's not our distraction for today, right? So let's stick to Northern Ireland. And now, such a term can be applied to a place like post-war Germany without any difficulty, and this is what I have done, and many others have done as well. But to use transitional justice for the UK might be a bit difficult. What do you mean? How can it be applied or justified? The simple answer to that is that if you look at Northern Ireland's situation, yes, it had some kind of democratic system similar to the majoritarian system one finds in Westminster, but with the very specific, let's say, socioeconomic, ethno-nationalistic, and religious circumstances in the devolved region, that kind of majoritarian system that ran from the 1920s up to 1972, so roughly after the partition and before direct rule, that didn't work. That didn't work in the sense that it created a sort of permanent minority whose rights were not respected, and a majority who were quite capable and willing to abuse the system to his own advantage, and that was stopped. That was called by what John McGarry and Brendan O'Leary called the hegemonic control that ended formally in 1972. So in that sense, transitional justice is rightly applied to the case of Northern Ireland to refer to the transition from one problematic, let's say problematic democratic system to a more suitable system, albeit a transitory system for Northern Ireland, as we have now, what we call power sharing consociational arrangement. About the second term, truth recovery, it appears a lot in the Northern Ireland context, but not only in Northern Ireland, but in elsewhere as well, when coming to terms with the past is a major theme. It means, as I use it here, to refer to what including recovering recording and remembering what happened to victims of political violence, including state crimes and paramilitary attacks. Recovery also here connotes healing. Truth recovery is not only as recovery of truth, but also recovery through and with truth. And the two areas of justice and truth have often fallen victim to the overarching political aim of obtaining and preserving peace. The two become some kind of price to pay for peace, so to speak. And in such a context, victims and survivors are often subject to social pressure to exercise mercy and forgiveness, or the state sometimes even forgives on their behalf. The GFA, or the Friday Agreement, is typical in this sense. The two areas of justice and truth are conspicuously absent by and large in agreement, aside from the review of the criminal justice system, which just basically looks at how to reform the criminal justice system so it becomes more balanced and fair and so on, not about dealing with past injustice. So in fact, one might argue that the early release mechanism contained in the under the prisoners section of the Good Friday Agreement presents an obstacle to justice and hence reconciliation, as the proponents of statutory limitation for British veterans argue. As a result, in Northern Ireland, some have received some truth and official apology, just as the Bloody Sunday victims or the families of the Bloody Sunday victims have received in 2010 when the Seville inquiry report was released. Thereupon, David Cameron offered his apology, calling what happened on Bloody Sunday unjustified and unjustifiable. But they haven't. They are still waiting for justice, though, in the sense of, okay, then what about those British soldiers still alive and who have committed those crimes? Prosecution is still ongoing. Some others have received neither truth nor justice. And the Sherman House Agreement of 2014, which aims actually to deal with some of the deficiencies of the Good Friday Agreement, has yet to be fully implemented. That was agreed in 2014. So I'll now turn to my just like setting the scene for what the two papers I'm presenting today, about transitional justice and truth recovery. And I'll now turn to my first paper, which I'll briefly go through the major argument, and the details can be already accessed from the published version. Now, statute of limitation is actually one of the key transitional justice issues. So in this one talks about for how long should a state continue to prosecute state crimes, after a major conflict has happened in the past. Should it be 30 years, 20 years, 15? All these numbers have been discussed and in fact, in some cases used in the cases I'm comparing here in post-war Germany and Northern Ireland. So it's a comparative work beginning with this curious coincidence of 20 years after 1945 and 1998 in both cases, that this question of statutory limitation became dominated in both parliaments. Yes, I'm a bit stretchy here with the 20 years. So one might speak of the long 20 years here and a short 20 years there. So please bear with me. The comparative framework is about, I'm trying to look at three main elements in both cases. One is victimhood. So whose victim are they talking about? Whose victimhood are they focusing on? Secondly, I'm looking at comparative justice. So in both cases, they compare a lot with others. The British MPs looking at, so what have the French done? What have the Germans done? What have the Spanish done? So on and so forth. And so did the German MPs, members of the Bundestag, trying to talk about what about the Czechs? What about the Russians and so on? When they discuss, how long should we continue to prosecute our crimes against the others. The third dimension, sorry, I almost forget. The third dimension is balance. What kind of balance they are trying to achieve, or did they try to basically not look at balance as a goal in trying to deal with the question of statutory limitation? And so with this comparative framework, I try to characterize the two different approaches, the British parliamentary approach and the German approach. By parliamentary approaches, I mean parliamentary debates, initiatives in the legislature, occasions giving rise to these debates, what are the inputs and outcomes of these different endeavors in the parliaments, the legislative processes, coalition and inter-party dynamics. So these are the materials or the empirics, if you like, that I'm looking at. So my sources are mainly the Hansard records and the Bundestag documentations. And then I analyze, how they debated this question and try to come to this two, the characterization of the two approaches. So I'm going into a bit of details with both approaches before trying to come to my argument, a normative argument for the what is called the asymmetric approach to the question of statutory limitation, and then give you a few updates of ongoing development. Now, with the British approach, there are several things that stand out. For one, is very clearly centered on the what I call the victim veteran, or the veteran as the victim. In the sense that victims or veterans like Dennis Hutchings and David Griffin, they are upheld by the proponents of statutory limitation in the UK, which, by the way, doesn't have a tradition of statutory limitation for criminal offenses. Okay, until now, we'll talk about what do I mean until now when we talk about the ongoing developments. So these proponents of those who support, let's say we need a British statute of limitation or something like it to protect veterans because they are victims of what they call lawfare, basically referring to the so-called vexatious lawsuits or investigations of alleged crimes committed by British soldiers, British veterans in the various operations like Iraq, like Afghanistan, and also Operation Banner in Northern Ireland. So the whole debate is focusing on, okay, these are the victims and the injustice is lawfare, and let's think about, what kind of solution to deal with that problem. That's the number one characteristic. Number two that I find quite prominent in the whole British debate on the question of statutory limitation is what a downward moralizing comparative tendency. Excuse me. I haven't been talking like this for some time now. It's a bit rusty. Now, this tendency manifests itself like this. A lot of times, parliamentarians would say, hey, look, of course, we want our soldiers and veterans to uphold the highest standards of rule of law, so on and so forth, humanitarian and human rights standards. But, they say, the paramilitaries, the terrorists, they say, in Northern Ireland, they have received amnesty through the early release mechanism, through the on-the-run letters, and so on. That's why British soldiers, British veterans also need this statute of limitations to protect them as a kind of balance. Of course, that's the examples they cited, whether they qualify as amnesty is very debatable, but that's the tendency to compare. But the direction is, when as we all do comparisons, it's sometimes you're trying to move up your standards, right? Sometimes it's moving down. And in this whole debate, what I find is this tendency is always going down. Let's compare so we can go one standard down instead of let's say, oh, the others are doing better, so we try to do like that. It's not like that. So number three characteristic about this pursuit of balance. I try to analyze in my paper what different groups mean by that. Different groups will say, okay, we need to reform the current system to be more balanced, but they mean very different things. For example, for the consultative group on the past, led by Robin Eames, so an Anglican bishop, and Dennis Bradley, back in 2009, they also advocated balance in the approach to justice. But what they meant at that time was a kind of balance of saying, okay, we need justice, but not too much. Maybe some reconciliation, some mercy, some truth, that kind of balance. Okay. With Theresa May, it's another kind of balance. They say, look, if only 10% of the casualties in the trouble, so about 3,500, a bit more than that, if only 10% of these casualties can be attributable to state forces, then the investigative efforts should be also 10%. That's not a very different kind of balance. And they complain the investigation has been overly concentrated on state crimes or alleged state crimes. So that's the problem they try to solve by 10%, that kind of balance. More aggressive or progressive proponents argue, like the Defense Select Committee, led at that time by the MP Julian Lewis, in the meantime becoming another committee chair, has some with some controversies. They argue, no, that's not the kind of balance we want. What we want is this. Because as they argue, the paramilitaries have already received amnesty through this runs and the early release mechanism. We want amnesty for soldiers. They don't call it amnesties, but a qualified statute of limitations, so that even investigations, those 10% investigative efforts should be, gotten rid of. So it's a different balance altogether. And but all of them, trying to pursue some kind of balance, which I find interesting as the ultimate goal, with no major opposition to that. So the fourth characteristic that I find is a rather weak opposition. On the whole, the parliamentary debate has been by and large internal, conservative and unionist affair, including yesterday, I would say, when they debated the Overseas Operations Bill. The typical Labour position there would be like, yeah, we are not really, disagreeing with the government. What we want is this or that amendment here and there, but on the whole thrust of it, we don't find, one doesn't find a very strong opposition to that. In fact, most of them simply refrain from voting instead of voting no to the bill. Anyway, coming back to what we have here now. So by contrast, when I look at the German approach, so basically looking at the debates more or less about 20 years as well, or 15 to 20 years, between the 1960s to 1979, when they had what they call the three Verjährungsdebatte, or the great debates on the questions of statutory limitation. I find quite different characteristics. For the first one, for example, I call it victim other-centered, meaning victims of one's own national crimes, in this case, victims of National Socialism. As the victims, they have suffered injustice, and the state is trying to reform the system so that it can better give justice to these victims. So even when it comes to victim-centered approach, as I argue in my paper, it's not all the same. Whose victims are you talking about? Secondly, a deliberate, a principled refusal to compare. There will be times, typically Christian Democrats or members from the CSU or the Christian Social Union would say, oh, what about the Russians? Did they deal with the Russian crimes against Germans? What about the Czechs and so on? They had amnesty. And then the proponents for stopping or prolonging the statutory limitation in the Bundestag would argue, no, it doesn't concern us. As Willy Brandt once said, something like "Uns geht Deutschland." You know, I don't care if the others go to hell. You know, that's from me. That's not from Willy Brandt. Okay, I don't care what happens to them, but for us, we discuss what is good. You know, what Germany needs to do in the West German Parliament, and this refusal to compare, in order not to be dragged down. You know, the one's own standards, I find amazing. And a third characteristic, which is quite typically German, I would say, until now, is the linkage between statutory limitation with remembrance, which is not an entirely, let me put it, intuitive kind of linkage. One of the major actors in this whole debate, Ernst Bender, a Christian Democrat, actually, with Jewish lineage, he was the minority within his party to introduce in 1965, trying to prolong the statutory limitation, the period of limitation, so that there would be more time to deal with Nazi murder. Because by 1965, like I said earlier, there were prevailing statutory limits for certain crimes like murder, like manslaughter, and so on. If the German parliament did nothing, if the Bundestag did nothing in 1965, you know, these Nazi crimes would have become verjährt, what they call verjährt, meaning unprosecutable. Ernst Bender was one of those few to rise up among Christian Democrats and say, no, this is absurd, this is shameful. He introduced what he saw in Yavashain, you know, a Jewish theological idea, theological resource, saying, you know, forgetfulness extends the exile, and the secret of redemption is remembrance. And keeping open the gate of prosecution is the expression of that national remembrance. In other words, if we stop prosecuting for whatever, you know, statutory limitation that we have, then we are not remembering the crimes we have done, you know, to our Jewish neighbors. And in fact, you know, just one of these little interesting anecdotes. Another Christian Democrat rose at some point in the whole debate, a much more senior Christian Democrat actually, and citing, you know, from some pope saying, you know, this is not a Christian way. You know, the Christian way is to forget and move on, because you can't prosecute that many people. But this voice from the Christian Democrats lost ultimately. Wait, coming back here, my argument, a normative argument for the asymmetric approach to justice. You know, what I try to do in my paper is to characterize the two approaches, how different they are, despite the very different origins of debate, different coalition constellations, and so on. I come to my normative argument at the end for the asymmetric approach to justice when state crimes are concerned. And I'll just read one of the last paragraphs from my paper. To borrow from Ralph Giordano's concept of second guilt, or die zweite Schuld. So Giordano has this idea, you know, the Germans has, you know, first guilt is the Nazis, you know, what they have done. The second guilt is all this cover up, all this procrastination to deal with the problem. That's the second guilt. Of this second guilt, he said, the post-war generation of Germans, the younger ones who were born after the war, they were the actual victims of the second guilt, because what the grandparents and parents have not paid off is transferred onto them. End of quote. So, and I apply this concept horizontally. I would say that the innocently burdened British veterans, meaning those who have done no wrong during Operation Banner, they are also victims of second guilt as well. For if investigations in the past had been fit for purpose, the elderly pensioners would not have to be re-subjected to investigation or the specter thereof at present. In this light, further attempts to minimize or even eliminate the prospect of proper investigation of state crimes through a statute of limitations, or as they call it now, the statutory presumption against prosecution, would only serve to extend the exile that Bender spoke of. and the horizontal transference of past burdens becomes vertical, meaning to the next British generation in due course. Ben Wallace, the present defense minister, defense secretary, showed keen understanding of this when he, as parliamentary undersecretary of state for Northern Ireland, actually defended the continual investigation of crimes involving British veterans. He said, and I quote, "If politicians interfere with the course of justice, we will not solve the problems of Northern Ireland. We will just extend those problems." End of quote. That was 2015. Now, what is he doing? Exactly, starting with the overseas operations bill, which, although initially doesn't apply to Northern Ireland, doesn't apply to the veterans who have served in Northern Ireland, but the government has repeatedly and explicitly expressed its intention to do so in the future. The update is that, like I said yesterday, they had their second reading or the first debate in the House of Commons, and they had it easily passed, so it moves on to the committee stage. But the whole debate has been somewhat eclipsed by the UK internal market bill debates, isn't it? So that's the status of the current debate, and that's the more or less the main argument of my first paper. I'll now move to my second paper, which is only finished as a first draft. Okay, so much more comments will be welcome about memory sharing and power sharing. This paper explores the relationship between the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of consociationalism and the culture of remembrance in Northern Ireland between and including the first and second executives, meaning between 1998 to 2011. It seeks to answer to what extent successes or failures in forming and running a working executive affected civil society attempts to foster curative remembering among and within deeply divided communities. Utilizing theories of collective memory and consociationalist theories, the paper analyzes initiatives such as Healing Through Remembering and Unity Pilgrim, so some of the groups that I've got in touch with when I was in Belfast. And I analyzed also the effects of the first and second executives and the interaction had, on these initiatives. Did the first affect the second, or were there no effects at all? And how this NGOs, how this civil society initiatives cope with the fluctuation of consociational energies. Conventional wisdom posed that the favorable political conditions are the preconditions for the success of social reconciliation projects. So first you need to have political conditions favorable, and then you can have successful social reconciliation projects. This is the conventional wisdom. I want to challenge it. I want to see whether that is the case on the ground. So if I may put it like visually, what I'm trying to do with this paper is to ask, okay, there's this thing called power sharing. I'm going to come to that in a minute. There's this thing called memory sharing that I'm coining and defining in my paper. If I'm going to plot them on a graph, how does it look like, through these years when the first executive more or less ran from 1998 to 2002, very unstable, and then from 2002 to 2007, no functioning executive. As John Tonge, based on John Tonge calculation, 40% of the time the executive wasn't running. So how can we explain peace in Northern Ireland by looking at consociationalism? The second executive was formed in 2007, a major political breakthrough. I mean, if you look at the press, look at the materials at that time, it's just like, miracle, mission accomplished with the DUP, Sinn Féin working together. Who would have thought about that? Huh? And in fact, it inaugurated the longest, 10 years more or less of uninterrupted executive, functioning executive. So what I want to ask is, okay, with this fluctuating power sharing in this period between 1998 to 2011, how does memory sharing look like? What kind of relationship they have? I'm not looking at, of course, very a kind of causal relationship, or even measuring memory sharing would be quite ridiculous, but conceptually in my mind, this is what I'm trying to ask, in my paper. So first of all, what is power sharing? Well, power sharing, we refer to this consociational system. In a nutshell, it's about grand coalition of unionist and nationalist parties instead of the single party majoritarian government that they had before in the 1920s up to the early 1970s. The use of proportional representation instead of first past the post, that kind of system. There are different variants of consociational design favoring moderates or extremes. What consociational theories call centripetal or centrifugal kind of consociationalism. But I'm not, going into that here. What about memory sharing? Power sharing is much more well known what it is, but what is memory sharing? It's something I try to coin and define here. I defined it here as the sharing of collective memories through memory processes such as joint commemorations, joint history writing, and joint history education through institutions such as museums, memorials, and archives, public archives. Now, these activities shape divided and conflictual memories of a traumatic past through inter alia, listening to and archiving survivors' accounts of one's own atrocities or crimes committed by one's own in-group, and truth recovery from perpetrators by mechanisms such as truth commissions, as well as the necessary accompanying act of what Michael Ignatieff called the narrowing the range of permissible lies and permissible offenses. Quite clearly, not all, sorry, I'll just refer you to the screen now. On the ground, this is what some of the actors call it, the common understanding of history. So what is memory sharing, right? A shared Protestant, Catholic, Unionist, and a nationalist, loyalist, and Republican memory. We don't have such a thing yet, but that's the goal back in 1999. Also about shared memories of earlier times, as the Unity Pilgrims call it. Not all collective remembrance qualifies as memory sharing. Okay, for example, like power sharing, memory sharing is by definition non-unicommunal, meaning it cannot just involve one community. Consociation requires some cross-community jointness if it is to do justice to the name. Hence, without underestimating the inherent value of intra-communal efforts to sustain, promote, or recover memories of their victims and survivors of others' wrongdoings, to promote their understanding of history and their narratives of the past, such activities are not by themselves considered, in my study, as memory sharing if their unicommunal nature is not fundamentally altered. In other words, only co-remembrance, for example, I have a concrete example in my paper, Catholics joining Alan McBride to mourn the Shankill bombing victims, that is victims of Republican violence, that is memory sharing. Okay, so in its various permutations, it can be inter-victim, so between different groups of victims, victim perpetrator, it can be inter-bystander, kind of permutation is also possible. Oh, this kind of thing I call memory sharing. What about European examples? Do we have European examples of memory sharing? Yes. Some of the prominent ones would be the Franco-German Agreement on Contentious Issues in European History, published back in 1958, jointly by German and French historians. They tried it in the 1930s. It didn't work. The political climate, didn't allow it with the Nazis in power. So if you ask them, they according to the interviews, these people would say, yeah, the political progress has to move forward before memory sharing like this can take place. Another example would be the 1972 recommendations of German-Polish historians and geographers concerning the treatment of Polish-German relations in history and geography lessons, published in 1972. A word about why political scientists study memory. When political scientists study memory, they are interested in the memory-power nexus. This includes not only how politicians make use of history to shore up their political claims and to lend legitimacy to policymaking, in which case memory functions as a kind of power resource at the disposal of those who can harness it, but also how memory shapes power constellations and places limits on institutional behavior, in which case memory behaves almost as an independent actor who has a logic of his own and is not amenable to willful manipulation. As Jan Wennemüller puts it, while present politicians have power over memory, memory also has power over them. Conventional wisdom, like I said earlier, puts it that progress in memory sharing follows progress in power sharing, the so-called trickle-down effect. One example of this view, there are many examples, but just highlight one clear example would be Paul Murphy, one of the former Northern Ireland secretaries. He said, if we were to have something along the line of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he said this when the executive wasn't functioning. He said, we first would have need two things. One is political progress, meaning the executive needs to be restored, and secondly, there should be some kind of public consensus on it. I was not convinced that we could get either. So with that, he put out the proposal or the idea to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Northern Ireland. So typical believer of this, or a typical formulation of this idea of political power sharing before memory sharing. So is this the case? So how can I, so if that's true, then the graph that I used earlier would look something like this. First, you need power sharing, and if power sharing is not working, then memory sharing would also suffer. And with the golden era of between 2007 to 2017, the 10 years of uninterrupted executive, then you will see memory sharing, soaring. Of course, we know this didn't happen. But how and why, that's what I try to elucidate in my paper. It's quite difficult to analyze memory sharing, to be honest. There's not center, like the executive representing. Of course, the consociationalism is not just about the executive, but at least you have some kind of focus. But memory sharing is grassroots, bottom up. So how do we see that? There are many civil society initiatives to deal with all these issues about truth recovery, remembrance, reconciliation, and so on, funded, by the way, a lot by the EU, peace funding, the EU peace funding, and also American philanthropies. I chose Healing Through Remembering as the NGO, one of the key NGOs to focus on. Another one is Unity Pilgrims. But they are very different sizes. First, a word about Healing Through Remembering. It is one of the more comprehensive umbrella grassroots organizations conducting or coordinating remembrance work on the ground, and arguably the most sustained and well-documented bottom-up projects of its kind. Beginning with the desire to learn from the emergent and perceived success of the South African model. South Africa was all the rage, in Northern Ireland at that time because of their successful overcoming of apartheid and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So they actually invited one of the deputy chairs, I believe, Alex Boring, to go to Northern Ireland, talk to people, and share the South African experience. With that, they published their first report, All Truth is Bitter. And with that, they continue up to this day to do research and to survey what people in Northern Ireland have been doing propose ideas like this idea of the private day of private reflection every year to commemorate the victims of the Troubles, and how to do truth recovery in the Northern Ireland context. So they have produced a rich body of materials and initiative information. The first board of HTR was chaired actually by an academic from Queen's University, Belfast, Professor Roy McClellan, and also it's quite a representative group, I would say. There are representatives from the victims and former offenders support group. There were relatives of Troubles-related victims. 2 former members of the UDR, or the Ulster Defense Regiment, 2 former paramilitary prisoners, a serving constable, a Catholic priest, and the president of Methodist Church of Ireland, Reverend Harold Good. So it tried very hard to be inclusive and comprehensive. And the structure of my paper is, first I had a theoretical grounding of memory sharing, what I just tried to explain in a few minutes, and then the structure is I structure my paper following the fortunes of the executive. The first executive from 1998 to 2002, in which period I find that the remembrance workers, they try to act as policy shapers. They try to shape government policy when it comes to dealing with truth and remembrance. And then came dysfunctional power sharing between 2002 and 2007, with different issues such as the failure to complete, decommissioning, brought down the executive, and for a long time it seems that the Good Friday Agreement was just like any other previous agreements that didn't work. And in this period, ironically, I find this emergent memory sharing that really befits the name as I define it here. Really intercommunal espousal of the other's narrative and so on. The activities during this period coming to fruition. And then came the second executive in 2007 to 2011. Like I said, big political breakthrough, like a miracle. But then, starting from then on, the HDR, the organization, actually went downward. And I try to argue that it's partly because of this administration. There's this grand coalition of DUP Sinn Féin. It's a coalition of silence. It's the kind of coalition you find. You say, I don't talk about your past, you don't talk about my past. Let's just have a shared future. And there are other issues that I'm going to explain later why an organization like HTL or memory sharing didn't rise, just like power sharing was working or having its golden era. So I trace the fortunes of the HTL proposals and initiatives. I mean, did their proposals become discussed or espoused in the political environment? How about their donation situation, their membership, and so on? That's how I try to analyze and have a post reading, so to speak, of memory sharing. And my main findings. I will come to our end after this. Okay, Alistair, I'm nearing the end of my presentation. The main findings are this. I'm going to read from sections of my paper. For the first time since the Good Friday Agreement, the Northern Ireland executive was able to complete its term in 2011. The second executive also inaugurated an uninterrupted decade from 2007 to 2017 of devolved administration, in which the devolution of justice and policing since 2010, the succession of party leadership while in power, so within the DUP, and even, my goodness, even the establishment of the very first official opposition in the assembly, 2016 to 2017, counted among the achievements of power sharing consociationalism. So I'm not trying to, as some others try to do, saying, consociationalism doesn't work. I think it works. It does what it's designed to do. These are real achievements. I'm not discounting this. I'm not disputing this. what I feel is this wisdom that after that you'll see all this memory sharing flourishing. It's not. Now, with the end of the Brexit saga at Westminster in December 2019, or preliminary ending, now is coming up again, devolution was also restored with the formation of the 5th executive in January this year. Now, what about memory sharing? Memory sharing in the same period, however, could hardly be said to have such major breakthroughs, at least when judging from the fate of the major HTL recommendations. The Day of Private Reflection turned public in 2011, but the attempts to make it official, to have an official day of reflection, remain futile. And although the idea of archiving survivors' testimonies and a version of truth recovery somehow found their ways into the Stormont House Agreement of 2014, their implementation have remained mired in political contingencies up to this day. In view of the much larger and decentralized scope of memory sharing, this limited study focusing on HDR can only offer preliminary findings with regard to the memory power nexus in Northern Ireland. Firstly, contradicting popular belief, there's no apparent correlation between political instability and memory blockage. If anything, HDR seemed to have its most productive and impactful years during and despite political impasse at Stormont. It's a bit ironic, but if you come to look at it, it's quite reasonable. It's precisely because the executive wasn't working. People try to look for ideas. People try to look for solutions. And it's in this climate that HDR was taken most seriously. The refrain that political progress in power sharing has to precede this or that memory sharing initiative turns out to be more of a belief at best. And at worst, they function as an excuse for obstruction or procrastination. Secondly, successful power sharing may, under specific circumstances, ironically present itself as an obstacle to memory sharing. As I tried to show in my paper, both international and domestic actors may interpret spectacular successes in power sharing, such as the so-called Chuckle brothers, Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley, ruling together, and then McGuinness shaking the hand of the Queen, and Paisley, having a good time with a T-shirt. All of these were interpreted as reconciliation accomplished. Now, the unintended consequence, as I've found in my study, is that all these supporters, financial supporters, donors, they started to shift their money elsewhere. They started to shift their donation elsewhere. And then initiatives such as the HDR suffered. Furthermore, whether or not the logic of memory sharing is embedded in the particular pack of power sharing also determines the relationship between the two. Like I said earlier, if the grand coalition between political extremes is based on the consensus of silence, that is, not dealing with the past or constructing a shared future without going through the trouble of achieving a shared past, as was the case with the second executive, then further empowerment of this devolution would only mean an enforced stalemate or languishment in memory sharing, at least when official processes and public funding are concerned. So despite the ever-presence of the past in Northern Ireland politics, I find the memory power nexus remains curiously understudied. And I look forward to continue to do work in this area. So to conclude, I think for my second paper, if I have to, plot it on a graph, power sharing and memory sharing doesn't look like this. Rather, memory sharing can independently develop on its own, but also affected by power sharing, as I was trying to explain in my paper. Transitional justice and truth recovery remain some kind of sacrifice under peace and reconciliation, the reconciliation discourse. Once again, just yesterday, when listening to or reading the Hansard records of yesterday's debate, Ben Wallace once again, cited, okay, we need something like that, statutory presumption against prosecution in Northern Ireland as well, for the sake of reconciliation. Again, reconciliation is used as some kind of argument for people to, sacrifice justice and truth. So the GFA has brought peace, but how to move on with the reconciliation process? That's the big question. Would it take a new generation from both nationalist and unionist communities, loyalist and Republican backgrounds, to break the sectarian loyalty and the family silence on the past in order to return truth to the survivors, and then based on that truth to return justice to the victims of the Troubles? I look forward to this, for this to happen. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Martin, for that stimulating talk. Possibly two talks actually, because there were two papers there, which was two for the not two for the one, because there was some clear value added in the presentation. I have a series of 7 comments, but I'll retain myself, however, because there's a lot of debate that we want the table. Just a couple of very brief comments. I mean, clearly, I think in a sense, we're all, as you said very rightly, we're all comparativists in a way. Maybe we compare with the past, maybe we compare within a country, we're all sort of comparativists. So I think in a sense, your thoughts in the first paper are very stimulating actually about how to compare. I suppose in a sense, which actors to compare is something we always think about, and maybe it was slightly more implicit than explicit, although it's clear that you were looking at parliamentarians essentially, and that was absolutely fine. So I think that there were a couple of things you said in that first paper that were very, very interesting. But the second paper was also extremely interesting. Power sharing and memory sharing. I'm not going to ask all the questions because these are obviously the ones that people want to talk about. But I think it was pretty innovative construction that you've got there in a sense. My only comment might be consociationism. If you go back to that literature on consociationism, it's meant, in a sense, it's an institutional arrangement for divided societies. But I think it's not necessarily originally as framed, not necessarily intended to possibly diminish the competition between rival communities. But obviously the way that it's evolved in the Balkans, in Northern Ireland, and so on. So we conflate institutions with, in a sense, effects, if you like, or ideas, or societal effects. But I mean, I'm not really sure if right at the very, very origins of consociationism. I mean, but maybe consociationism itself has changed somewhat its meaning. Let's move on. Those were not questions; they were just comments. My question went away. Let's pick up some because we don't have much time. If I may, let's go around the room and pick up some similar questions and comments. We'll go around this way. You start.
Hi, Martin. Thank you very much for your talk. I very much enjoyed it. I learned a lot, especially as you know, as a Cambodian genocide survivor. Those questions are very dear to me. I have 3 questions for you, very simple ones though. The first one is about your methodology. So what did you do to amass the material? Did you go and talk to people and ask them about how they cope or do not cope with this reconciliation process or truth-seeking process? So that's one. The second one, I think you mentioned at some point in your talk that it's difficult to measure or quantify memory or power sharing, yet you came up with 2 graphs. And I'd like, if possible, you to show again one of the graphs, just one, because while I'm quite clear about the horizontal axis, which represent the years, I'm not quite sure what the vertical axis represents and how you could have quantified memory sharing into numbers or power sharing into numbers. So I would love to write myself, a nice article with graphs like that, but I'm not quite sure how you can come up with this quantification. And last question is about whether your comparative study between the German and the British model whether you could have extracted a kind of model to be exported in other societies. So whether you have come up with like an ideal solution for reconciliation, whether there is the right amount of power sharing, memory sharing, and the process, the ideal process that leads to healing societies to full reconciliation. Okay, those are my 3 questions. Thank you, Martin.
I'll continue with chat, Mark, if I may. It's up to you to decide whether you want to have a quick response to Emily's triptych of questions there, or whether we go around. I mean, actually, Emily's questions were pretty tough there. So what do you answer straight Emily's questions, and then we'll carry on going round. I mean,
Easy question.
It's up to you. You're the chair, Alistair. You're the chair. But I'll try to keep my answers short so that others have more time to interact. First of all, to your comment, Alistair, about consociationalism not originally designed to lessen that kind of antagonism, and I think you are spot on. In fact, that's one problem that I think I also see, and consociationalist theories have discussed a lot, is the present settlement with the Good Friday Agreement. Yes, it has achieved peace and so on, but it doesn't really require the different traditions to look at their part in a critical way. In a way, it even legitimizes. It simply legitimizes saying, okay, this is a legitimate. Unionism is a legitimate political ideal, so is nationalism, and so on. But what about critically reflecting on what happened in the past and what is one's own answer to the victims of one's own wrongdoings in the past? This is not part of the design, as you said, and different agreements afterwards, different inquiries, commissions, civil society actions have been trying to fill this void, and so that's precisely what I want to look at. So under this Good Friday Agreement, there are deficiencies, there are achievements. How do others try to fill in the holes left open by the agreement? To Emily's very good questions about, first of all, quantification. Sorry, I made an impression that my paper is a quantitative paper. It is not at all. You won't find any of these numbers, not even the graphs there. I basically thought of this as a way to visually help me explain what I have in mind to do. The vertical axis, of course, is about percentage. If we say in 2002 or between 2002 and 1998 with the functioning first executive, so it worked. But what do I mean by work? By 75%? Of course, I don't have an answer to that. What I want to show is, in my mind, what I want to see is how the two things interact. And is it really like what people expect, memory sharing would follow progress in power sharing? That's the main thing I want to look at. And I haven't even tried to quantify the memory sharing at all. What I try to show is, okay, when I say within the interaction between 2002 and 2007, HTR was its most productive. What I mean by that, then I look at what they have proposed, how these ideas were being taken up, for example, in the Northern Ireland Assembly, how different interest groups try to join in, so on and so forth. These are not quantifiable, quantitative kind of evidence, but this helps me show what I want to do, basically. About European model for others, in fact, the Northern Ireland case has been learning from Europe all the time. I mean, as I think Alistair possibly also already mentioned him already, Aaron Leipart, as using the Dutch example of, again, very divided community, Reformation legacy and so on, but how consociationalism helped in comparison to what they call liberal democracy, majoritarian kind of system. So from the very beginning, Northern Ireland is learning from Europe, not very specifically from Germany. So it's something I say, okay, maybe I can say something new here. But yeah, learning from Europe has been there all the time.
Right. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Martin, for that fascinating set of responses. It's true that life, I mean, in a way, we won't go into that, but it is, you know, we just mentioning pillarization and so on. I mean, clearly, it's something that you know, in a sense, we always need to go back and read the classics. You know, we forget what they say. Actually, if we ever read them, we didn't. You know, we did read them, of course, a long time ago. But we ought to refresh our minds occasionally. Let's move around the table. You guys have probably not met each other yet, so you might introduce yourselves. But Jaemin, will you do you want to have a question? Or?
Yeah, I have two questions. I'm Jaemin again, one of the new. Can you hear me? Does this one have?
I can hear you very clearly. Although I can't see you, but I can hear you. No problem.
Very good. I have two questions, and the first one is again related to the method part, a bit related to what Emily pointed out. I can actually imagine how you can quantify the power sharing part, because it's usually measured as the composition of cabinet. If it's, let's say, 50-50 unionist and nationalist party, you can kind of say if the power has been shared to that extent. But I think it will be much more challenging to quantify the memory sharing part, because it manifests in many different forms. You don't know where specifically to go and measure. Even if your purpose is to do qualitative research, I think it makes sense to make this measuring process a bit more systematic. And I thought at least two things you might want to consider. One is, instead of just looking at one like NGO or like one interest group, you might want to at least include one left-leaning or one right-leaning NGO. So whatever evidence you find is not just a result of an organization's ideological spectrum. And another is to look at both like what organizations say and what they write, because sometimes these two things don't go do not go hand in hand. So at least you know these by using these methods, you might want to triangulate and then try to make as systematic as possible. And second question is, I was wondering about the global implication of your research, especially as a Korean person. I was just wondering how your research can be applied to the Northeast Asian context, especially in relation to Japan, mainland China, in South Korea, and Taiwan. I was wondering how the idea of virtual cycle can be created in the Northeast Asian context based on your insights through your research. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. I think Martin, you please, you two have a conversation.
Yeah. Quickly respond. Also, the quantifying, it's not really my initial impulse to do that. But now, having heard of like how it has caught your attention, I'm now a bit tempted to maybe think about it. Maybe it's not so terrible after all. But by nature and by training, that's not what I think I do best. Trying to work numbers, and in fact, I must confess, when I look at a lot of this numbers game, and I myself would basically just like laugh and say, what does that mean? Anyway, but I would give it a serious thought to think about at least some kind of indicators of how that might work in measuring, or more of a systematically measuring memory sharing. Okay, that's very helpful. Now, secondly, global implication. Jaemin, we can talk a lot. One of my, although I'm trying to continue with my research on Europe, I'm from European studies, and trying to focus on different conflict zones in Europe, so to speak. Northeast Asia is always part of the inspiration for me, why I started doing this. In fact, some of my previous work basically compare Chinese and European or German coming to terms with the past, the politics of apology, politics of history education, and so on. So far, not much success, I would say. You can do all these comparisons. You think you found, this is the right lesson to learn for Northeast Asians, but dream on. You can just continue to publish, and politics happens as it is. It doesn't. I don't see any great improvement, to be honest.
Okay, thanks, Martin. I think you will. I think you two will have a very interesting debate when you come back, because there are clearly some issues of there's clearly some common ground here. So that's extremely interesting. Kenneth, would you like to take the floor?
I try to be brief. Thanks so much, Martin, for your papers and a very, very coherent presentation. I would take up the challenge. You're inviting us to comment on your ongoing work or thinking about your work. Particularly, I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit more about how memory sharing is being institutionalized. I'm thinking this in terms of what Jean Monnet said a long time ago, while commenting, reflecting on the foundation of the 3 original European communities. And he said quite explicitly that, we live and we die, we pass away, and of course we carried the memories away, memories of the past, the atrocities and the devastations away with us. But what we could leave behind would be a set of institutions that would embody collective memories. And the set of institutions that he referred to was, of course, the European Community and now the European Union, with those very cumbersome treaties, decision-making mechanisms, policies, and so on. So in terms of memory sharing, in order for that to be useful, not even talking about being effective, in order to be useful, relevant, you mentioned about museums, you mentioned about public archives. Now, just how significant, in your view, are those efforts towards institutionalization of memory sharing, while at the same time, if the most concerned parties, the political leaders, have failed to really bring the power sharing mechanisms, the Northern Ireland Assembly particularly, up and running? And also, by extension, a very brief remark on collective silence, sort of putting things away, and we run our own sort of parallel discourses or narratives about what happened in the past. The case of Poland could be interesting for your consideration. When Tadeusz Mazowiecki, the first Solidarity Prime Minister, came to power in 1989, he introduced a so-called thick line policy. In Polish, it's Gruba Kreska. That means forget about the past, we move on. And then, of course, it worked for only a short period of time. As soon as he left the political stage, I think Poland is still living in the past, still trying to sort of clean up the mess with the illustration, with the vetting of the judges, and causing lots of troubles now between Poland and the European Union on the state of rule of law. So I just want to sort of pick your brain a little bit more and asking you to sort of maybe comment on that kind of collective silence and what consequences or implications there might be for peace in Ireland and Northern Ireland. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you. Alistair, should I respond directly?
I think what we might do is just see if there's anybody out there.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that.
Is anybody out there? Yeah. Okay. If anybody's out there who wants to also ask Martin a question, that would be great. If not, Martin, the floor is yours. I mean, a very fine question from Kenneth. So,
Yes, thank you, Kenneth. Very substantial suggestions. Thank you so much about institutionalizing collective memories, especially looking at the EU case and Northern Ireland. I haven't done that, to be honest. Especially when thinking about where. I mean, when, for example, coming back to my paper, when even this very regional and grassroots organization like the HTR, the Healing Through Remembering, it took them so long to try to push to have just one institution, a day of reflection, to become official in the sense that the government, the assembly, the executive would recognize it, would participate in it. So far, no success. I see a very big obstacle there, very great resistance to something like that. And basically the problem is who is a victim? Should they be considered a victim? Should those who have participated, who have orchestrated violence, be also considered as victims to be remembered? It hasn't been answered satisfactorily in any sense. So I could only say I don't see much of that institutionalizing collective memory or shared memory happening so far in Northern Ireland. It's more like, okay, you have your parade, I have my own parade, you have your own this remembrance, day of remembrance, I have my own whatever. It's more of I take care of my own memory, so you take care of your own, and we just try not to clash. That's all, around and sharing. Nothing of the sort that I find in the European case, where yes, you have German reflecting the past, but also from time to time, the French with the Vichy syndrome, publish and create a lot of debate, and with Jan Gross neighbor in Poland again, debating about the past. That possibly one can plot some kind of trajectory in the European case. But do I see that in Northern Ireland? I tried to talk to once I talked to a unionist historian. We attended a conference. He was the keynote speaker, and I asked him. I said, "Hey, I don't notice something like that happening in Northern Ireland yet, but in post-war Germany, something interesting is at a certain period of time, about 1 or 2 generations after the Holocaust, there were young Germans born after the war. They would look into their family archives. They would look into their little town and city archives to expose the lies about the past, the lies about the family. Oh, that guy was celebrated as an anti-Nazi hero, but actually he's not. He was a Nazi supporter. People did something like that, or something like that emerging in Northern Ireland." And then he looked at me like, "No, no, there's no like Catholic family, young Catholic members, trying to ask their grandfather, so what did you do during the Troubles? What happened to that or that bombing and so on?" Again, I see there's a certain time lag, perhaps, but the obstacles could be quite similar. Loyalty, the in-group loyalty, the family allegiance, and so on. A very interesting direction to look at. So thank you, Kenneth. That is possibly next paper topic.
Okay, thank you, Martin, for that very full response and very full question. Do we have any questions from the virtual world? I mean, I think we're sort of. I think we've had a really fascinating seminar. Actually, some of the questions, I must admit, the way that the debate turned on quantification surprised me a bit. But in a way, I suppose you invited it with the graphs,
Yeah, that's why.
I mean, I like visualizations. I think they're great, but usually there's a few figures behind them. Anyway, that doesn't matter.
I wish, Alistair, I wish I had read your paper with more attention, so I could just say, "Oh, I'm going to apply this or that quantitative methods for the qualitative materials," and then we can plot those graphs.
No, but anyway, that was a really super presentation, Martin. I thought it was excellent. I was thinking of the Spanish case is an interesting one, just to finish. The Spanish, it's very, very clear that the Spanish Civil War left a huge fracture, and it's not been reconciled in any senses. I mean, when we look at what's going on at the moment in Spain, and the whole controversy over Franco, and so in a sense, these memorial issues are so deeply entrenched. But as you also put out, I mean, I think Kenneth's question about what are the forms of institutionalization of memory, and I suppose in a way, what sort of conditions need to be fulfilled for that, but what more simply than that, what are the examples? Because there are clearly counterexamples, and the European Union, whatever one's position on it, the clear notion of historic reconciliation between hereditary enemies, if you like, is one of the it's one of the continuing strengths really of that European idea. So I think in a way that we've had a very interesting and hopefully fruitful talk, Martin. I hope this helps you to refine one or two things there. I think it set the standard. Set the standard, and our standards are high in the Department of Government and International Studies, and we want this to carry on, of course. And so thanks very much for spending your time to everybody, and everybody who could join us in. Thanks as well. Maybe next time we'll make sure that we get the people in the virtual arena, the virtual forum, more associated as well. So apologies for that. But anyway, thank you very much, and thank you, Terence, for officiating. Well, I suppose I'm officiating, but thank you for organising, and indeed Ivan, who's not with us, but he's with us here in spirit, and everybody else who participated. So on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Advertisement of the next talk. Do we have the topic for the next talk? Can we do a little advertisement already?
We can indeed. We can indeed. Emily, when's your talk?
October 15th. Kenneth, you can.
October 15th.
Yes, I don't have this with me. Aaron, do you have it with you? Looking for the advertisement, looking for the post.
I got that.
We will look forward to the updates then.
Dr. Emily Tran.
Yes.
And the title is.
Thank you.
So next talk is by myself, which is hugely awkward to advertise your own talk, and it's about China's foreign relations with France, and it's part of a special issue for Mediterranean politics, and we are looking at China's deployment in the Mediterranean countries.
Wow.
Which should be a super paper. And we would advise everybody to come along and listen to Emily on that.
Thank
That's something I can really attend in person. I seriously hope so.
Yeah, well, hope to see you soon, Martin.
I hope to be there.
And thanks very much. Okay, so I think we've had a good session. So thanks everybody for.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Winning.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
So